Great, and with that, I'd like to welcome all of you to today's colloquium. We're very happy to have Alon Zivony as our guest today. Alon actually finished his PhD in cognitive psychology from Tel Aviv University under the mentorship of Dominique Lamy. He then received the British Academy's Newton Fellowship and the Marie Curie Fellowship to do his postdoc research with Martin Aima at the University of London in Birkbeck, where he currently conducts electrophysiological research on temporal dynamics of selective attention. Alec also has been involved throughout the last few years in a lot of public engagement activities and has been repeatedly honored for his outstanding teaching activities. So today he will be talking about a new view or conceptualization of selective attention. And we're very excited to be hearing more about that. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the word to Alon. We're very glad that you're here.
Thank you very, very much, Laura. I'm very excited to be here. Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, so this talk is called Attentional Episodes. What are they and why should you care? Some of this is going to be pretty obvious to those of you who are studying attention, but I'm trying to kind of keep a baseline introduction to allow everybody in. As all talks about attention, we must start with a definition of what is attention, and with William James, who famously said, everybody knows what attention is. The rest of the sentence, it is taking possession of the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. So a very poetic, elegant way of basically saying, we're focusing on one thing while letting other information kind of dissipate. And this basic idea guided attention research ever since its inception. And I think that the most well-known model of attention is Broadband's filter model. Right? And in Broadband's filter model, we basically have a linear process of processing, and attention plays a very, very important role. So we start by inputs, right? So we get information and we go to early perceptual processing. And in this stage, we basically have a lot of information that we can process. And we can kind of feel that we can process color and we can process orientation and all these features. And all of this information goes to an attentional filter. And the attentional filter kind of picks out of all these strands of information, it picks out a specific strand of information that goes to higher level processing. And from higher level processing to memory and consciousness and responses. And that's basically the filter model. Now, obviously this is 1958, right? Obviously we've been discussing Broadband's filter model a lot since, a lot of criticism has been levied against it. For example, one big discussion point was called the early selection versus late selection debate. Okay. And in this debate, basically the main question was, what constitutes as early, that is pre-attentive processing, versus what counts as higher level, that is post-attentive processing, right? And this debate has been raging for decades and decades and decades without any clear resolution. There are some good suggestions and some suggestions that got a lot of traction, but not a lot of clear resolution. And one camp says, the early selection camp says that pre-attentive processing are only processing that kind of low-level features, color orientation, and post-attentive processing is of identity, semantic content, whereas the late selection camp says that pre-attentive processing includes semantic processing and higher level processing, like the post-attentive are only kind of memory functions and response selection functions. So keeping that in mind, I'll come back to this discussion later. Another thing that came from this original line of work is that attention research kind of matured and talking about different domains of attentional selection, right? The attentional filter kind of selects a specific strand of information. So for example, we now can discuss and talk about spatial attention, and spatial attention is kind of selection of specific areas in space. And we can talk about temporal attention, that is selection of different points in time. Okay, and we're going to touch upon spatial attention and temporal attention later. There are a lot of other domains. This is kind of just an example. And to give a concrete example of spatial attention, I'm going to show you a lot of letters. And among these letters, there's a digit. Okay, and the digit is going to be inside a square. So I want you, those of you I can see, to kind of raise your hand once you can identify the digit. Okay, ready? 3, 2, 1. Okay, not yet. Inside the square. Can you identify it? Okay, great. So we can see, right, there's this digit 4 inside the square. It's pretty easy to find, right? We know it's inside the square. The square is both salient, and I told you to look for a square. So that means it kind of moved around your spatial attention towards this digit, and that's why it's so easy to find. An interesting question is whether you noticed this other digit, right? So there was this other digit in the visual field. Obviously, it was much more difficult to notice, right? It wasn't inside the square. So that means that spatial attention wasn't on that digit, making it more difficult to notice. From an early selection, late selection standpoint, these are basically the two positions. The early selection camp would say that only identities of attended objects are processed. That is, 4 was processed, but 8 was not. So you didn't even process the semantic identity of 8. That's why you didn't notice it. The late selection camp says that all the identities are processed, but only attended objects reach conscious perception. Right, so this is a kind of subtle position. Say you did process all these identities, but it didn't reach your consciousness. Somewhere along the chain, something broke off. That's why it didn't reach the final stage of memory and consciousness. Right, so that's kind of a brief summary of the field of attention and the idea of attentional selection. So far, sounds okay, right? But not all is well in attention research. So here are 4 examples of people who are very critical of attention. Bernard Hummel says, in contrast to James, right? He says that nobody knows what attention is. Right? That's the title of this provocative paper, basically saying there are so many fields of attention, nobody really knows what attention is. Anderson says there is no such thing as attention. DiLollo, another big name in attention research, said that attention is a sterile concept. And this one I really like. Alport 1993 says, it is dreadfully confusing talking about the different conceptualization of attentional selection. So there's a lot of criticism about attention as a concept that directs and defines a field of research. And I won't go into all of the criticism, but here's 2 major things. One thing that these authors are saying is that it's unclear what we mean when we say selection, right? When we say that attentional selection, does that mean that attention selects? Is attention the force that decides what's relevant or what's irrelevant? And if it is, it kind of sounds like attention is this homunculus, right? It's kind of this creature living in our brain called attention, and it kind of, this one is relevant, this one is not relevant. And then giving attention human traits is always obviously a problem. Another possibility is that attention modulates then what caused the selection. So it's unclear when we say attention, does it select or does it moderate? And there's all these kind of problems with circular logic around these issues. A second question is, how can perception be linear if neural processing is not, right? So in Broadband's filter model, we had this linear stages of perception, from early perception to late perception to memory. But we know, neurologically speaking, that perception doesn't work like that. We have a lot of parallel processing, right? Our brain doesn't have this stage by stage process. It all works, relative. A lot of things work at the same time. And also in the last 20 years, we know that a lot of processing occurs via recurrent processing, right? So we have a feed-forward process of like information going through the different stages of the visual cortex, V1, V2, V3, V4, but then it goes to the frontal cortex and it comes back, right? The processing is not just linear, there are also feedback loops. Okay, so these kind of two criticisms to keep in mind when we go forward, and I want to suggest an alternative that can kind of meet both these criticisms. Our diagnosis of, by the way, feel free to ask questions when we go along. I sometimes don't notice if I'm being clear or not. Our diagnosis of Broadband's filter model is a little bit different. And Broadband has been widely criticized throughout the last 50 years, and there are so many different criticisms, but we're suggesting that there's one aspect of Broadband's model that's still being kept alive, whether implicitly or explicitly. And we call it the synchronic account or synchronic view of attentional selection. What do we mean by that? Synchronic means a specific moment, right? So this idea that selection takes place at a specific moment in time. So this attentional filter, you can imagine there are all these strands of information coming in, and they're this specific instant where all of the strands become into one strand that is continuing forward. And also that selection is all or none and instantaneous. That is, a strand of information, a bit of information is either selected or not selected. Okay. These two ideas are very, very common, whether explicitly or implicitly, in most models of attention as we know them, right? Even models that criticize Broadband would still keep, in a way, this synchronic view of attentional selection. Okay, you can sometimes find it like whether it's from early to late perception or from late perception to memory, there's always this moment of like not attended to attended, and attended becomes completely attended and then goes into the next stage. Okay, so that's our diagnosis, this synchronic account. That's what we think is kind of behind all these problems. We're going to suggest a different view, which we call the diachronic account of selective attention. Okay. What is diachronic? It means that something that unfolds in time. Okay. So what do we think is going on? First of all, there's an input, something external to us. Then this input goes into the visual system where it kind of splits apart, right? The brain kind of have different areas that kind of process different aspects of the input. So in this case, if I'm looking for a digit inside the square is my selection feature. That is, that's what's guiding me to select this property, okay? So the square is going to be processed. This is sensory information where higher amplitude here means that there's a better representation of that information. And we kind of think that, you know, sensory information is not all or none. We kind of accumulate evidence about the presence of the sensory information. And this grows in time. Okay? Then we think that once we detected the selection feature, we're going to have triggered something that's called an attentional episode. And this is kind of the key concept for this talk. So what's an attentional episode? By the way, this idea of an attentional episode is not ours. Reeves and Sperling, 1986, already talked about this in their computational model. And this idea was also adopted in Weibel et al., 2009 and 11. So we kind of, as the saying goes, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. So what's an attentional episode? It's a brief period of intense and spatially specific, but otherwise indiscriminate enhancement to processing that unfolds in tandem with perceptual processing. Okay? So I'm going to kind of explain what that means in a moment, but that's basically the two important things is indiscriminate and in tandem. So you can see this point in this dashed line. This is what we call an engagement threshold. And this is the point that the system decides, oh, I have enough information that the selection feature is present in the visual field. Let's trigger an attentional episode. And this is what an attentional episode would look like. And here, the amplitude means that the higher the amplitude, the more enhancement processing receives. Okay? So this is now going to be a period of time where every and all stimulus inside these specific coordinates are going to be enhanced. So for example, the attentional episode, it's triggered by the sensory information, but it's also going to enhance the sensory information. Okay, so there's kind of back and forth between these processes, right? And importantly, the attentional episode is going to enhance also the sensory information of the target's identity, okay? So notice this is very different from a synchronic view because it's not that attention selects the square and the 4 at the same time. The square kind of triggers something, and then that something, this attentional episode, also is going to enhance the identity. And you can see this is kind of time, right? You can see that there's a correlation in both space and time between the activation of the square and the activation of the digit. Because this correlation, we're going to get an output, right, of 4 inside the square. Okay? So it's a bit more complex than the idea of standard synchronic attentional selection, but this is something that can also explain how an object that we perceive that is external to us can be perceived as an object in the visual system. Okay, this is basically our view, right? That we have this attentional episode that is not a specific moment, it's a period of time, and it unfolds in tandem with perceptual processing. So there's no pre-attentive and post-attentive. There's attention that kind of spreads over time, and that's why we call it diachronic account. How to differentiate, right? We're suggesting this specific idea. How do we differentiate between the synchronic account and a diachronic account? And the main thing that's going to help us is this word, indiscriminate, right? So the synchronic account is the opposite of indiscriminate. It's very discriminate. It says that attention selects a specific piece of information, right? So it's very, very deliberate. The diachronic account says something different. The moment that the attentional episode is triggered, it's going to be completely indiscriminate. All information is going to be amplified during this period of time. So a first prediction of the diachronic account is that detecting the target item can result in the encoding of an irrelevant item. I'm going to explain in the next slide what that means. And a second prediction is that detecting the target can result in the encoding of multiple items. Okay, again, this I'm going to come back to later. So these two predictions are something that will differentiate between the synchronic account versus the diachronic account, because according to the synchronic account, detecting the target means that you select the target. And according to the synchronic account, detecting the target, and you know that you're looking for just one target, you're going to select just the one target. There's no reason to select more than one target. Okay. So before I showed you a visual field with a lot of different letters and digits, but that's only one frame, right? So in order to differentiate between synchronic and diachronic, we're going to go to a different kind of task. And this is what's called an RSVP task, Rapid Serial Visual Presentation. And in this task, basically we have information that pops on and off, on and off, on and off, on and off. And this is very, very fast. This is 50 millisecond frames, for example, and 50 milliseconds ISI in our task. Generally it's 10 Hertz, so it's like 100 milliseconds per frame, right? So this is very, very fast. Now your task, if this wasn't Zoom, I would show you the actual task, but I can't, right? It wouldn't work well. Your task is to find, again, the digit inside the square, okay? And even though this is very, very fast, participants are generally pretty good at this task. So we get like about 80% accuracy, okay? Right, so this is taken by models of temporal attention as kind of evidence that, oh, we're very good at selecting things in time, right? And this can be explained by both the synchronic account and the diachronic account, so that doesn't differentiate. But here's the question. So notice that the distractor, right, a non-target that follows the target is a letter, right? 4 followed by an E. What do you think will happen if we change that and now it's followed by another digit, let's say 9, right? So if we're temporally very good at selecting the target, this shouldn't matter much, right? But what do you think happens? It actually matters a lot, right? So you can see this dropped from 80% to about 40%, right? This is a huge drop in accuracy. Now, why would that happen according to the diachronic account? So if this is the digit that we're looking for, and it triggers an attentional episode, during the same attentional episode, we also get the irrelevant digit, right? And because perception is based on a correlation, and this digit is also going to be activated, a lot of the time, we're going to get this, an illusory conjunction, right? Where the digit's identity is merged with the target's selection feature, okay? And this is what's called a distractor intrusion, because the distractor intrudes into our mind. And in our experiment, right, we get about 45% of the time people respond, and they confidently respond that they saw, oh, I saw, let's say in this case, a 9 inside the square. Okay. So this is a very robust effect, and it's very easy to recreate. Right? Okay, so on its own, this distractor intrusion phenomenon, I'm going to kind of use it to discuss the synchronic account, diachronic account. But the diachronic account is not the only possibility to explain it. So the first step I want to do is try to explain what causes a distractor intrusion on a specific trial. That is, why is it that on some trials I'm correct, and on other trials I have a distractor intrusion? Okay, what differentiates between these two trials? Okay, so according to one account, Botella 2001, a distractor intrusion is caused by a failure of attentional selection. So that's kind of a representative of a synchronic account, basically saying that you didn't select correctly, so you have this sensory information and you're just going to wing it, right? saying, oh, I saw 4, I saw 9, but I don't know which one of them because I failed to select. Therefore, you're going to get an intrusion. We said something different. We said that the attentional episode is sometimes delayed. What do we mean by that? As we said, detecting the selection feature should cause an attentional episode. And then if the attentional episode is kind of quick enough, it should result in a correct response. But this process of detection is not all or none. It's also developing over time. So it can sometimes be slower. For example, detection is based on, it can be affected by perceptual noise, by expectations, by alertness, right? All of these factors can make the detection process a little bit slower. And if the detection process is a little bit slower, then you're going to get something like this, right? So the black one is if we're early, right? We're detecting quickly, and you can see that most of the activation would go to 4. But if we're a little bit slower, right? Most of the activation would go to 9, and then the correlation is going to be different. Okay, how are we going to compare between these two accounts? At this point, I'm turning to electrophysiology. And specifically, we have a very good component in electrophysiology that's going to allow us to discuss these two accounts. So, what do we know about electrophysiology and selective attention? When we view this kind of screen and we have the target on the left side of the visual field, we're going to have a spike of activity in the contralateral side of the visual cortex. Contralateral, that is on the opposite side. So if there's activity, the target is on the left, we're going to see a spike of activity on the right. Now, we can measure that. We can have 2 electrodes, right? Electrode on the left, electrode on the right, and we can measure activity starting from the target's appearance. So for example, on the right, this is kind of like an activity you would expect to find in an RSVP task. And this is the activity from the left electrode, right? Where there's not a spike of activity. So you can see that between these two, there's a lot of similarity, right? What's the difference? Around 200 milliseconds, you see here we have this bump of activity that is missing in the other electrode. So to better see that, we simply subtract one waveform from another to get this difference wave, okay? So this difference wave is basically just a way of us to quantify the difference between the electrodes. And you can see around the 200, 300 milliseconds, this bump, and this is what we call the N2PC. No matter why it's called that, it's just called the N2PC, and that's our measure of selective attention. Okay, how does the N2PC allow us to differentiate between the two accounts? So both accounts agree that if we have a correct trial, we should see an N2PC, right? Because Botella says that this is when attentional selection worked, and we say that this is when attentional selection was on time. What about intrusion trials? Well, Botella would say, oh, an intrusion trial occurs because there's a failure of selective attention. So we should not find an N2PC. We say it's because of a delay of an attentional episode. So we say we should find an N2PC, but it should be delayed, right? Relatively straightforward. There's another account that we're discussing in the paper, but I won't go into now, okay? So should we find an N2PC or should we find a delayed N2PC? So this is the paradigm that you already know. And this is kind of our results in electrophysiology. And this is what happens when we have a correct trial. And you can see this very clear N2PC between 200 and 300 milliseconds. And what do you think happens when there's an intrusion trial? You can see that there is an N2PC, but it's delayed. right? So exactly like what we expected, we have a delay N2PC on intrusion trials. Now, an interesting thing about this delay, remember, this paradigm is 100 milliseconds per frame, right? But the difference between the N2PC on correct trials and intrusion trials is only about 20 to 30 milliseconds, okay? So I'm going to come back to this 20 to 30 milliseconds because this is something that requires an explanation. How come the difference in the RSVP is 100 milliseconds and here it's about 20 milliseconds? How is the difference of 20 milliseconds in the attentional episode going to result in a different kind of response? Okay, I'm going to come back to that later. Now this result is fortunately very easy to replicate. So it replicates, we replicated I think about 4 times now. We replicate it when the target is defined by its color, and we replicate it when the target's location is known. Okay, so this is not a delay of the shift of spatial attention. This is a delay of the attentional episode itself. Okay, so this is a first study that we ran. But it's not the only possibility. Saying that the attentional episode is delayed, it's not only to explain distraction intrusions. Okay, so here, this is what we suggest, that we have an attentional episode that can either be early or a little bit delayed. But Broadband, actually the same Broadband from 1958, also suggested something that you can define as delayed attentional selection, right, in 1982. And this is why it's very good to kind of read the literature thoroughly before you start working on something, because this is something that in 1982 already thought about. So he suggested something different. He suggested that detection and identification are 2 different processes. And that basically, when you're correct, detection and identification are kind of very close to one another. You detect the target and you immediately identify the target. So I'm putting a hand because the kind of idea of selection is something that kind of picks out something from the stream. But sometimes they suggested, there's a discrepancy between the detection and identification, and then you detect the target, but identify the distractor, right? So this is very similar to what we said, which leads me to the second prediction, right? So what's the difference between our diachronic account and Broadband synchronic account in this case? So if you look at the synchronic account, you would see that Broadband always suggests that we're going to select one item. It might be the wrong item, but it's always going to be one item. And look at our attentional episode, right? So we're saying that in both cases, you're going to have some activation for both the target and the distractor. So what we're suggesting is that with an attentional episode, 2 items can be encoded, right? So triggering an attentional episode can actually result in more than one item being encoded at the same time, right? And Broadband would say, no, you should have only one item every time because you're only looking for one item. So only one item should be selected and encoded. Okay, how do we check for that? So what we did is we used exactly the same paradigm, only now we gave participants 2 guesses per trial, right? We told them, you know what? You can have another guess if you need it. You always have 2 forced choices. Even if you saw just one target, give it another go. Maybe you encoded something that you didn't notice. Right, so this is the first response, and you can see exactly the same pattern as you saw before. When the target is followed by a letter, then you have high accuracy. When it's followed by a digit, accuracy falls. And a lot of the times you get intrusions. The interesting question is about the second response. Specifically, we wanted to know what's the likelihood to make an intrusion response on the second response if you already correctly identified the target, and what's the likelihood to correctly identify the target on the second response if you already committed an intrusion response on the first go, right? What are the options? If we have only one item, right? Let's say you only encoded the 4, right? Now I'm forcing you to give another response. You would say, I don't know, let's just give it a go, press something, right? Then on chance level, you're going to hit the intrusion response every once in a while, okay? In this task, the chance level was 1 in 6, so the next response 1 in 5, 20%. But if you always encoded 2 items, you wouldn't expect 100% accuracy, right? You would expect something at like around 70% accuracy, which is aligned with the responses when there is no digit distractor, right? So this is what you would expect in the best case scenario if you have 2 items at a time, okay? And what do you think we found? Well, in the middle. So definitely not 1 item at a time, but definitely not always 2 items, okay? So how can we explain? We'll explain that in a moment. Okay? But this is just behavioral. So, you know, you might have some kind of response bias or response strategy. Maybe sometimes people perceived both of them at the same time, but didn't want to respond or anything like that. So once again, we have this conclusion that we have a fluctuation between 1 item and 2 items. The target identity is inaccessible appropriate. But we wanted to base this on something that is impervious to response bias. So we went again to electrophysiology. And this is what happens when people report 2 items. And you can see this nice N2PC, right? But what we cared about this time is this later period, right? You see this lingering tail, and this is called the CDA, no matter why it's called the CDA. Now, the CDA is not a measure of attention per se, it's more a measure of items in working memory. So what does that mean? The larger the CDA amplitude, the more items people are actually storing in working memory. So this is a good measure for us, but it kind of tells us, regardless of participants' response times, is there actually a difference between 2 items and 1 item, right? And if there is actually a difference, we expect that the 2 item responses should have a larger CDA amplitude than the single item responses. Right? Because 2 items, we have more items in working memory than 1 item. And single items, this is exactly what we found, right? So we have this verification that there is actually a fluctuation between 2 items sometimes and 1 item sometimes. Right. Another small aspect of this result is, I'll skip this, why this is important. If you want, I can talk about this later. Another small aspect is that even though we didn't expect it, we found a small difference in the N2PC latency. What is the difference? 2 item responses have an earlier N2PC latency than single item responses. We didn't think of this in advance, but if you think about it, this actually makes a lot of sense. Why? Because if you have a very early attentional episode, look what happens. It enhances both the target and the distractor. But what happens if you have a later attentional episode? Basically, at some point, if it's late enough, it's barely going to enhance the target at all, right? So you're only going to get an enhancement of the distractor, which is going to override the target, and then you're going to have a single item response. And looking at the behavioral results, this is a little bit tricky to see, to understand, but if you already responded with the correct response on the first go, you're more likely to report the second item, the distractor, than if you started with reporting the distractor, right? So this is exactly kind of this idea of an earlier episode means you see the target and then you see the distractor. And if you have a later episode, you're going to see the distractor, but you're not going to see the target sometimes. Let's see how much time we have left. Okay. I think I'm going to skip this because this is not central, but if you want, I can come back to this. If any of you knows the attentional blink task or lag-1 sparing, we have a slide about the relationship between distractor intrusions and lag-1 sparing. But I'm going to skip it for now. Okay, summary of the empirical findings. So a distractor appearing 100 milliseconds after the target is very often reported instead of the target. Right? So this is the distractor intrusion, the basic finding. Intrusions correlate with the timing of the N2PC, and the difference between correct responses and intrusion responses is about 20 to 30 milliseconds. This distractor can be encoded together with the target, right? So two items might be encoded because of the single attentional episode, but it can also completely override the target. So this suggests that there's a competition between the target and the distractor. This is what I skipped, so I'm going to skip it here as well. So here's what we think is going on in the brain while all this is going on. Let's think of the first 100 milliseconds starting from the target's appearance, right? So the target appears, and we know that it goes to the LGN, to the thalamus, and then from there to the visual cortex, right? So within 100 milliseconds, even less, the target is going to reach V4 where it's going to be processed. What's going on in the second 200, from 100 to 200 milliseconds? Well, the target's processing doesn't stop here. It continues, right? Even though the simulation is now gone, right? The target is gone. The information about the target's presence is going to go to the thalamus, in this case, the pulvinar, and then go to the frontal eye field, where it's going to be processed, recognized as the target, and then you're going to have this feedback activity. Okay? And this feedback activity from the frontal eye field and from the pulvinar, this is basically what triggers the N2PC. Okay? Remember, we take the N2PC as kind of our measure of the onset of the attentional episode. Right. So this is all happening in 100 to 200 milliseconds. But at the same time, we have the distractor, right? So the distractor doesn't care about what else is going on in the brain. It also sends a signal to the thalamus and then to V1, right? And up to 200 milliseconds, the distractor also reached V4, right? So what's going on afterwards? Well, the distractor is gone, but the signal of the distractor still is going on in the visual cortex alongside the signal from the target. And because we got this recurrent processing in this N2PC, all the signals in the visual cortex are going to be enhanced together. Okay? So the visual cortex, same coordinate, is going to process both the target and the distractor. And because of this attentional amplification, which is basically our attentional episode, right? Both of them are going to kind of benefit from enhanced processing where they're going to compete with one another. So we think that the target and post-target are processed in the visual cortex at the same time, right? And this kind of explains why the 20 millisecond difference can make such a big difference, right? Because it's about relative activation. And if we start the recurrent processing 20 milliseconds earlier, this could give the target this boost that it needs to overcome the competition with the distractor. But if we start a little bit too late, right, then the feed-forward process of the distractor is going to overshadow the target. So the post-target reaches the visual cortex just in time to benefit from recurrent processing that enhances activity. And this is basically our attentional episode, right? It's not just a conceptual concept, it's actual activity based on feedback from the prefrontal cortex. And the competition, right, that both of them are processed at the same time determines which item or items will be encoded and in what order. So, to finish, here are a few take-home messages. First one, we think that we show that attentional episodes are an important part of our perception. And that kind of means that attention does not select, right? Attention is not a homunculus that kind of says, oh, this is important, right? So attention might seem voluntary, but once an attentional episode is triggered, it basically amplifies everything, right? So attention works in the visual cortex, and once triggered, basically it's indiscriminate. It doesn't know what's relevant and what's irrelevant anymore. And it also shows, and this is a kind of philosophical point, that introspection can be a little bit deceiving. So we kind of feel subjective reality kind of flowing smoothly from one moment to the next. But these distractor intrusions kind of show that that's not really what's going on. And we know this, but it kind of puts an emphasis on it, that our subjective presence is actually reflecting an elaborate calculation based on the past hundreds of milliseconds. We're always living in the past. And sometimes, you know, we feel like we're seeing something with our own eyes, and our eyes are just receiving the information. But our brains, our minds is telling us, oh, this is actually what's going on. And the brain might, you know, not catch on to what's actually going on. So we might have these illusory conjunctions. And one last thing, what about early selection versus late selection, right? This debate that raged on for 40 years or more between opposing camps. So according to our view, neither is correct, because the early selection, late selection is based on the idea of synchronic selection. That means you have to have a moment in time that separates between pre-attentive and post-attentive processing. But we're saying that there is no such moment in time. Attention unfolds in tandem with perception, right? So here's what we think is going on. All sensory information can be extracted in the feed-forward sweep, right? So all information is kind of low, in a low-level quality is already extracted when we get to the visual field. But that doesn't help much, right? Because all sensory information is this is kind of like a late selection view, right? And if you think of the packed visual field, we're kind of saying, yes, you did get some sense, some information about all the digits. They're just competing with one another. But at the same time, all sensory information is modulated by attention, right? The late selection view basically said that early perceptual processing and semantic processing is completely independent from attention because it occurs before attention even kicks in. We're saying, no, you can't say this kind of thing because every sensory information is going to be affected to some degree by attention. So no aspect of perceptual processing is entirely pre-attentive. And we think that this is kind of a nice resolution to a debate that, due to lack of kind of conclusion, was generally just abandoned. Okay, so this is basically the end. I want to thank Laura for inviting me, and I want to thank my lab, Modern Either and the Brain Behavior Lab. I want to thank my funding agency, the British Academy, and I want to thank you for listening. Thank you so much, and I would love to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. That was a great talk, very interesting.
Thank you.
So so we'll open up the round for questions. I would like to ask anyone who has a question to just post their name in the chat so we can sort of keep this a little organized. If you prefer, you can of course also just write your name and then your question in the chat, and I will read it out. But you're of course free to ask your question yourself. Okay, so Edmund wants to go first. Oh, and there's lots of other popping up, but Edmund, please.
That's lovely.
Okay. Thank you for your talk, really great. And I think it's a nice model. But actually, two questions on that. First of all, why do you need this, you know, with the invention of this feedback from the frontal areas, you again introduce a homunculus, kind of homunculus. Why do you need it actually? You know, there are many ideas on the same stuff from physiology approach, which have feedback loops just in the visual cortex, and it makes the same.
Great. So first of all, I completely agree that there are many, you know, not that anyone is asking me, but of course, there's so many feedback loops in the visual cortex itself that are not dependent on kind of prefrontal processing or pulvinar. This is, for me, I'm kind of conceptually, I don't really care where the feedback is coming from. It just happens that the N2PC, there are studies that show that the N2PC is kind of triggered by processing from the frontal eye fields. So regarding the homunculus, I think the part that we need explaining still is this detection part, right? That we're saying that there is some system that is meant to detect the target. And what we think is going on is that the voluntary parts of selection is that basically you have a template in mind. You decide on a template of what you're looking for. And once you decided on a template, that's the voluntary act. But from there on, it's kind of becoming involuntary. You get this tripwire that is going to be triggered once you have enough information. So that's the part where, you know, we have some voluntary control over what's going to be selected. But once we kind of decided on our template, then we forego control. We don't really have any more control.
Okay. No, but sometimes also, you know, let's say the environment decides what you are attending to. So if you have really strong stimuli in the environment, you know, it's not your decision, not from the beginning. So only the visual cortex can decide what you attend to. So it's the same process. And I know we had loads of discussions about that. So whether, you know, the bottom-up detection of something is the same process than selecting something, you know, by intention. So I believe it's absolutely the same process.
So here's something that I didn't show that is kind of, you're giving me the option to kind of show a different line of work that I've been doing. I agree with you that when we don't have a very specific goal in mind, then bottom-up saliency would completely govern what we attend to. But when we do have a specific goal in mind, then you're going to have this divergence. And this is kind of you can still see the screen, right? So this is a queuing paradigm that that I did during my PhD with Dominique Lamy. And in this task, you have to search for a red letter, right? And in this case, saliency is not enough because all the letters are equally salient, right? And before then, you have this Q. And the Q can either be in the relevant color or the irrelevant color, in this case, gray. So I completely agree that bottom-up saliency is important, right? And that's why you get these location effects. This is basically saying that when the Q is in the same location, you get faster reaction time than when it's a different location. So this is basically Posner effect or queuing effect. And you also get that with the irrelevant color. So the Q onset can capture attention. It does something, it prioritizes something. But we have another measure of the attentional episode. So this measure is of compatibility effects. So when the Q appears in a distractor location, so in this case, it appears in kind of the upper right corner, right? If there's an attentional episode, this means that we should indiscriminately amplify this identity, right? And in this case, the distractor is incompatible with the target. So we need to say whether it's an E or an H as quickly as possible.
Okay. Yeah.
So what we find is that with the relevant color, we get a clear compatibility effect. So the Q enhanced the processing of a distractor, even though the distractor was irrelevant. But with the irrelevant color, nothing, right? Now you might say, oh, this is because that we have such a small effect and it might have scaled down, but we treat that in the article, we're kind of showing, even if you take the largest location effects or the irrelevant color, right, and you compare them, you find no compatibility effect for the after an irrelevant color Q. So to summarize, I agree with you that when we don't have a clear goal in mind, then yes, bottom-up saliency is going to be sufficient to trigger an attentional episode. But when we do have a clear goal in mind, then you're going to have this voluntary attentional template that is going to be crucial in triggering an attentional episode.
Or biasing it.
Or
biasing it, just just modulates it to something.
Again, I agree that there's biasing going on in the visual cortex, and I'm not coming from a neuroscience background. I'm from a hardcore cognitive background that completely disregards the brain. It just happens that the calculation of what triggers an N2PC is based in the frontal eye field and the pulvinar. So it's not just low-level feedback in the visual cortex. It does depend on kind of farther-reaching feedback loops.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, then Daniel wants to ask a question. Daniel?
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear you. Okay, thank you for the very interesting talk. My question refers to something you said rather at the beginning of the talk. So when you referred to this earlier investigation, also with the RSVP paradigm, and you said, okay, they actually assumed that these intrusion effects should be due to an error to select, or an attentional selection error. And then you said, okay, if this is true, we shouldn't find an N2PC. And actually, I couldn't follow this this assumption, or is it, because how would you report the 9 if you wouldn't have shifted attention to the left or to the right side previously? So is this really a select? So I can't really think about this as an error regarding selection not having taken place at all. You know what I mean?
Yes. I agree. I think that honestly, Botella's account, I didn't completely. They had to make some assumptions that I didn't completely understand why they made them or how it kind of makes sense. And yeah, I agree with you. Something has to happen for the 9 to be reported. Now, what they're doing usually is showing not just target digit followed by another digit, but basically a lot of digits, right? All the stream is just digits. And what you see is this kind of gradient of responses. But still, I agree with you. Something has to happen. Some selective process has to happen for the items near the target to be reported. And you always find this bias. It's not like that when people are committing these responses, they just randomly commit these responses. It's always either the target or something close to the target. So I completely agree with you that it didn't completely make sense. It was just nice that they made like a bold prediction they made kind of two-step prediction. Like there's selective attention and there's this kind of sensory, whatever you have, you're going to base on that. So making their strong prediction kind of helped us out to kind of say, oh, we have our account, we have this different account, even though, you know, we don't, we didn't agree with it, obviously.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, then Fabio can go next.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, thank you for the great talk. I really appreciate your model. I have two simple questions. One, I would like to ask how your participants provided responses. Did they have to press a button or was by voice? How did they respond?
Yeah, it was always button press.
Okay, thanks. And another thing, I was thinking that the identification of a number can be considered also a higher order kind of recognition. So what's your prediction about using some low level features, like for example, shapes instead of numbers and letters? Would it change something?
So generally, just distractor intrusion in general have been shown with all different kinds of like different combinations, different paradigms. There is a big literature about this. I'm thinking specifically about the N2PC and what it would change. One thing I know that changes, okay, so it can change the amount of time that sensory information from previous items are going to linger. And that might affect the correlations in a different way. Mm-hmm. You're right that in our paradigm, we kind of relying on the fact that the selection feature is the lower level feature, right? That is identified before the identity. But what would happen if we do the opposite? If we make participants, okay, select based on the identity and then report the item. Mm-hmm. Then I'm not sure that we'll find the same correlation. Though maybe I think we might because I think in our model we're predicting that basically the attentional episode is going to amplify everything regardless of whether it's a low level feature or a high level feature.
Okay.
So it might be a weaker correlation. I'm not sure.
Okay, but in fact, related to this, I was also thinking that if I got it right, in your paradigm, your participants only had to respond after the presentation of all the stimuli.
Right.
But what if you ask them to press a button in the exact moment that they perceive the target and then report the identity? I think you just responded.
Interesting. So Botella had a study with reaction times where you had to respond the moment you saw the target, but it also had like an identity component. They had to respond like, what do you think the identity was, as fast as you can. And they also found that reporting the post item results in slower reaction time.
Okay.
Also, by the way, I think it was about 40 or 30 milliseconds slow reaction time, so it kind of fits.
Okay.
But do you think it's going to be different if people just have to say, oh, I saw something, and then it's interesting. It's a good paradigm. They just have to say, I saw something, right?
Yeah.
And at the end, they're going to have to say what they saw.
Exactly. Yes, that's what.
And then thinking. You still, I think you might still find that correlation. If you find that if they say just I saw something, there'll be 20 milliseconds later on trials where they reported distractor. That's a very good idea. Very cool.
Will be nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, then we have another question by Sherry.
Hey, thank you for a great talk. I just have a simple question about whether you have done this work in older adults who in general tend to show these delayed potentials and tend to be more distractible. So have you shown this effect in older adults yet, or?
I suggested it to a co-author of mine that he has a lab where they do research with older adults, and they collaborated with him, Daniel Levy. We kind of had like a conceptual disagreement, and then we didn't eventually do it. But I completely agree with you. I think that you'll show that older adults are much more susceptible to distractor intrusions than younger adults. And younger adults are pretty susceptible anyway, but I think we're going to show exactly because of what you're saying, that you're going to have higher distractor intrusions in older adults. But no, nobody's done it. So, you know, if you have access to older adults, go ahead and do it. I think it's going to be an interesting study.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and we have another question by René.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the amazing talk, very inspiring. And so I don't come from a cognitive, but I come from a more neuroscience oscillations background. And so we worked a lot on how attention is related to oscillations. And there is some literature showing that like something like the attentional spotlight is blinking rhythmically. And this idea of your attentional episodes, like it perfectly matches this idea of like this rhythmic spotlight boosting, like, or eliciting those episodes every, I don't know, 100, 200 milliseconds. And I thought, like, at the beginning of your talk, you said something like that an episode can be delayed because of, I don't know, or the episode is triggered by some external stimulus, and sometimes it is delayed. And by this, you explain a lot of your findings in the RSVP task. Can it be that just by, I don't know, between trials, it differs when this spotlight enters this RSVP stream? So sometimes it is internally triggered and not externally triggered. So internally, we have this clocking rhythm every 5 times per second. We just do this episode, or we trigger an episode, and we can extract something from the stream. And sometimes this episode lies, I don't know, rather,
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, completely. I think it's a very good line of thinking. That's kind of what we meant by expectations, but not entirely. What you're saying is more specific. I'm actually trying to work with Andreas Kale, I think I'm saying his name correctly, that also works on oscillations. They kind of see whether exactly what you're saying, whether something internal about the way we're processing the RSVP kind of determines whether we're going to be delayed. So I completely think that like oscillation research has a lot to say on this. But I will say that, you know, there are like extremist oscillationists that are saying, oh, the N2PC is just resetting of the oscillation. That I don't think is entirely true. That I think that we do have some kind of a transient activity that occurs when we detect the target, that it's not just oscillations. I think oscillations play a big part of it. I think that the transient activity, my cat is, by the way, came to say hello, that the transient activity is riding on top of oscillations, right? But I don't think it's the entire story. I let him in because otherwise he would just meow and would disturb the conversation. But yes, I completely think that it's worthwhile to look at what's going on with oscillations before the target appears. I think we might find something interesting there. And it might be worthwhile and interesting to look after the target appears to see whether oscillation tells us a different story. Because I think that what might be going on is this perceptual noise or sensitivity to perceptual noise is basically just whether we're actually on time, clocked correctly with the RSVP, whether it's correctly entrained, or we kind of get wobbly and then, oh, the target is here, but we get it takes longer to find it.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. In general, I want to say this paradigm is so easy to use and you get so many different angles. I'm just surprised that like so few people use it. Most people using an RSVP task are basically just trying to show the attentional blink effect. And the attentional blink is very interesting. I love the attentional blink, but it's just looking at distractor intrusions alone can be like a very easy project to run because it's such a robust finding. So I'm trying to market like distractor intrusion research.
Oh, great. Okay, if you still have like a few more minutes, I also have one more question. So basically, and I guess this also comes from like these traditional models of selective attention. So mostly we think of selective, or well, the reason for selective attention being there is that our processing system is essentially very capacity limited, right? Now your account proposes now that once an attentional episode is triggered, anything, right, that occurs during that time window will be processed or prioritized in a enhanced manner, so to say. So do you still think that there is a capacity limit to that? Or, I mean, I would guess there should be, right? But so how do you incorporate that in your model?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think that it's not a capacity limit per se. It's more that capacity limits are a side effect of what's going on. Specifically, this idea of perceptual competition. Let me go back to that slide. This idea of perceptual competition is something that's going to create capacity limitations, even though, or even when there are no hardwired capacity limitations, right? So just because once you have the same cells, right, the same area in the visual cortex, trying to process two things at the same time, these things are going to disrupt one another. Right? So let's say you have 4 items really rushing by at the same time, one after the other, right? Now you've put like a lot more competition. So yes, if you have 4 items in a very short span of time, you increase the likelihood that you report more than one item, but at the same time, you increase the competition, right? So which item is going to be reported is going to be a bit more difficult for the system to decide on. And you know, the more items you put, the more competition, right? Let's say you put 16 items. I don't think that we're sensitive enough to be able to process so much information. But again, it's not a hardwired capacity limitation, as is a competition that kind of enforces a capacity limitation after the fact.
Okay, thank you. Then I think we have one more question by Nico.
Sure.
Hi, thank you so much. This is really fascinating. If I understood you correctly, you implied that you have tested this paradigm in a lot of different ways, with lots of different variations. And I'm curious, have you also tried to present the cue that indicates the target for the subsequent frame when the distractor is presented? And the reason I'm asking is because it appears to me that your paradigm, and especially your explanation, your theoretical account, has so much in common with Enns and DiLollo's explanation of object substitution masking, which is all based on this re-entrant processing and the fact that by the time the re-entrance happens, a new stimulus is on the screen and in the brain.
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, thank you for the connection with DiLollo's work. We have in the, what caused Laura to invite me is a preprint that I put online about this work. And we have a reference there to DeLallo's substitution masking. And DeLallo has this discussion with a researcher called Podol. And they have this disagreement that Podol says something about attentional gating, which is very similar to what we're saying. And DeLallo says, no, it's completely just reentrant processing. And we think that this position is kind of like a bridge between the two, because I think that it is attentional gating in a way, but it's also because of recurrent processing. DeLallo has like a bit of a different thing about recurrent processing, saying that it's kind of a verification process. I think we're saying something that's very similar. It might be just like a conceptual kind of semantic disagreement, what we call the correlation between all the items. But yes, I think it's very, very similar to object substitution masking. Second thing you asked is about the next item over, and to see if it shares the selection feature.
It should, if it shares, if it's similar to object substitution masking, that should make the first target invisible.
Right. So that's kind of the study that I skipped over, which we had a few experiments where we manipulated also. This study you have to select based on the color, right? So you have to report T1, the target, is the colored digit. It's no longer the digit inside the circle. And the target was either followed by another colored digit, or it wasn't followed by a gray digit, right? Our main point was to look at effects of expectations. But a side finding that we found was that, exactly like you said, when there's a colored digit followed by another colored digit, accuracy is lower, right? So the second colored digit is going to mask more strongly the target, which makes it even more peculiar why in lag1 sparing, you get such high accuracy for both targets. But that is maybe, we don't have enough time to discuss what we're finding exactly. It's mainly, it's an effect of expectations. That's what I'm going to say.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, well then, thank you, Alon, for this wonderful talk, and thanks to everyone else for the great discussion and your contributions. Yeah, I would say we should wrap this up right here, and I hope that you still have a nice evening, and I would like to thank Alon again for being our guest today, and hope that we'll see some of you again in one of our future colloquiums.
Thank you so much, and feel free, anyone, to contact me, Twitter, online.